He paid her father's debt in raw gold, every last coin of it, and walked away with her like she was part of the transaction. She had no idea the scarred riverman had been looking for her for 11 years. The autumn of 1883 came down hard on the shores of the Saint Lawrence, the way it always did in that stretch of Quebec near Ile aux Grues. Fast and without mercy, the maples burning red one week and stripped bare the next. For the Beaumont family, the cold that year carried something worse than frost. It carried the sound of a debt collector's boots on the porch. Eugene Beaumont had borrowed against his fishing license 3 winters back, when the ice storm took the roof off the smokehouse and half the season's catch rotted before they could get it to market. The man who held that note was named Aldrich Thorne, a portly, well-dressed property agent out of Quebec City who smelled of bay rum and courthouse paper. He had no interest in fishing licenses, in soot-stained smokehouses, or in the quiet dignity of a man who had worked the river since he was 12 years old. He had interest in the property line, the dock, and the house itself, which sat on a quarter-acre of waterfront that developers from Montreal had recently begun to covet. Thorne arrived on a Tuesday in late October, his black carriage, kicking up the last dry leaves on the lane, flanked by a constable he had brought along for appearances. Eugene met him at the door, hat in hand, his wife Margot standing just behind him in the frame, one hand pressed flat against the doorpost as though the house itself needed steadying. Their daughter, Lisette, watched all of it from the side window of the kitchen. She was 22 that year, lean and capable in the way that girls who grow up working river households tend to be, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn jaw. She had spent the morning mending net cord, and her fingers were still stiff with it. She watched Thorne speak and her father nod, and she understood, the way you understand a thing in your stomach before your mind has named it, that the numbers had run out. Thorne was making his position clear in a voice loud enough for her to hear through the glass. The note was called. The property would be seized before the first freeze. Unless, and here he paused, turning his gaze toward the window with a practiced, deliberate slowness, unless another arrangement could be made. He had a house in the city. He required a capable woman to manage it. A 2-year domestic contract for Lisette would retire the debt entirely and allow her parents to remain in the house through the winter. After that, he would revisit the terms. Margot made a sound that Lisette had never heard from her mother before. Something between a sob and a refusal, smothered behind a closed fist. Before Eugene could answer, before Lisette could even push away from the window, the sound of heavy boots on the dock cut through the yard. Not the quick, purposeful stride of a working man, but the slow, deliberate weight of someone who was in no hurry and afraid of nothing. He came around the corner of the smokehouse with the river still on him. His wool coat dark with spray, his boots leaving wet prints on the dry boards. He was a large man, broad across the shoulders in a way that had less to do with ambition than with decades of hard labor. A thick reddish-brown beard, threaded through with gray, covered most of his face. A burn scar ran from his left jaw down the side of his neck, pink and permanent, the kind left by steam, a boiler accident or a fire below decks. He carried a canvas satchel over one shoulder and a weathered captain's log tucked under his arm, and he moved through the yard as though he had every right to be there. His name was Declan Rourke. On the river, they called him the Ironback, which was not a flattering name so much as an accurate one. He had piloted cargo vessels on the St. Lawrence for 15 years, running freight between Montreal and the Gulf in all weathers, through ice and fog and the kind of November storms that sank lesser boats. He was not a man who inspired warmth on first impression. He inspired the sensation that the temperature in a room had dropped by several degrees. He stopped at the edge of the yard, looking at Thorne the way a man looks at something he has already decided to deal with. "I heard the terms," he said. His voice was low, roughened by river air and years of calling orders over engine noise. Thorne turned with the expression of a man who has not been interrupted in some time and does not enjoy the novelty. This is a private matter, Rourke. You're not part of it. Declan set down the canvas satchel. He opened it, drew out a heavy oilcloth envelope, and held it out toward the constable without looking at Thorne at all. "Count it," he said. "It's $600, bank draft drawn this morning in Levis. That covers the note and the interest, and whatever inconvenience fee Thorne here has added on top for his own comfort." The constable took the envelope with visible uncertainty. He looked at Thorne. Thorne's face had gone a particular shade of red that had nothing to do with the cold. "The debt is paid," Declan said. "The property stays with the family. The girl's contract is mine." Inside the kitchen, the floor seemed to tilt beneath Lizette's feet. Eugene Beaumont had the face of a man watching two disasters arrive at once, unable to determine which was worse. Margot gripped his arm. Thorne sputtered something about the legality of third-party settlement, but the constable had already opened the envelope and was counting quietly. And the law in such matters is seldom on the side of the man with bay rum on his collar. Declan walked to the kitchen door and knocked twice, then opened it himself. He filled the frame entirely, blocking out the pale gray October sky. Lisette took 2 steps back without meaning to. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. There was something in the way he did it, not a survey, not the cold appraisal she had braced herself for. It was closer to recognition, as though he had been looking at her face in his memory for a long time and was now confirming that the memory had been accurate. "You'll need your winter things," he said. "We leave before the tide turns. I have a vessel moored at the Pointe-au-Père dock. You'll have your own cabin. You'll be paid a fair wage for whatever work you're able to do." "You bought me," Lisette said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "I bought your father's debt," Declan said. "That's different, is it?" He didn't answer that. He turned and walked back out into the yard. She packed in 20 minutes. 2 dresses, a wool coat, her grandmother's rosary, the small leather journal she had been keeping since she was 15. Her mother held her at the door for a long time without speaking, and when she finally let go, there was something in her eyes that looked less like grief and more like a prayer directed at a man neither of them entirely understood. The vessel was a converted lake freighter, narrow-hulled and practical, named the Sainte Marguerite after a stretch of the river it had apparently run for years. It smelled of diesel, raw timber, and river water. Declan's crew consisted of 2 men, a stocky Acadian engineer named Felix, who communicated primarily in grunts, and a young deckhand from Rimouski who was either shy or indifferent and kept his distance from Lisette with careful precision. Declan himself was a study in contradiction. He never raised his voice on the boat, though he commanded it absolutely. He never spoke to Lisette carelessly, and he never spoke to her warmly. He gave her the small aft cabin with its own porthole and a proper latch on the door. He left meals outside the door the first 2 evenings without knocking, the way you might leave food for an animal you were trying not to startle. On the 3rd morning, when she came up on deck before dawn and stood at the stern, watching the dark shore slide past, he appeared beside her without announcement and stood there silently for several minutes before pointing out the lights of a lighthouse she hadn't recognized. "Pointe des Monts," he said. "My grandfather piloted this stretch, called it the Throat because the river narrows there and even a calm day could turn a boat sideways." "Did he survive it?" she asked. 42 years on the river. A pause. Died in his kitchen, falling off a step stool. It was the first time she had heard him come close to dry humor, and she didn't know what to do with it. By the 4th day, running east through the lower estuary, the skies opened into the kind of rain that the Gulf delivers without apology. Horizontal, freezing, relentless. Lisette was on deck when it hit, reaching for a loose line that had been bothering her, and within seconds she was soaked through. Declan appeared from the wheelhouse, took one look at her, and without a word stripped off the heavy oilskin he was wearing and dropped it over her shoulders. It was enormous. It smelled of river and engine oil, and something underneath that was inexplicably clean, like cold stone after rain. "Get below," he said. already turning back to the wheelhouse in his wool sweater, the rain hitting him flat across the shoulders. "We're running hard for Matan. I need the deck clear. I can handle deck work," she said. "I know you can. I'm still telling you to get below." She went below, but she didn't go to the cabin. She went to the galley and made coffee and brought 2 cups up to the wheelhouse without asking permission and set one on the console beside him. He looked at it, looked at her, and said nothing. But he drank it. By the end of that first week, something had shifted in the quality of the silence between them. It was no longer the silence of strangers or of a transaction. It was the silence of 2 people learning to exist in the same small space without collision. He taught her how to read the river's surface for hidden shallows. She taught him that the coffee was better if you let the grounds settle before pouring, a thing he had apparently never considered in 15 years of making it badly. He corrected her instinctively when she reached for a rope with the wrong grip, his hand covering hers for a fraction of a second before he caught himself and stepped back. She began to notice that he always positioned himself between her and the open rail when they were on deck together, without seeming to think about it. It was 3 weeks into their time on the river when she found the tin. She had been cleaning the small shelf above the chart table. Declan was ashore in Gaspé for supplies, and behind a stack of current charts and a spare compass, she found a battered tobacco tin with no tobacco in it. Inside, wrapped in a square of oilcloth, was a child's hair ribbon, pale yellow, faded almost to white, with a small brass clasp shaped like a leaf. Lisette went very still. She was 8 years old again, standing on the wharf at Île aux Grès on a summer afternoon, one braid half undone from running. She had leaned too far over the edge to look at something in the water below, and she had gone in, gasping, the cold a shock that drove the air from her lungs and scrambled everything orderly in her mind. A boy, older than her, maybe 15, with serious eyes and river-round hands, had come off the dock after her without hesitation, pulling her up against the current and hauling her onto the wharf like she weighed nothing. He had sat beside her until the shaking stopped, and when it had, he'd reached up and refastened the loose end of her braid for her, tying it with her own hair ribbon that had come loose in the water. He'd found the ribbon floating. He'd saved it. He'd given it back to her with a seriousness entirely disproportionate to the small act, as though it mattered. She had lost the ribbon the following winter when their house flooded. Lisette stood in the wheelhouse with the tin in both hands, her breathing entirely unsteady. The brass leaf clasp. She would have known it anywhere. She heard his boots on the gangway before she heard the door, and when Declan came in and saw her standing there with the tin open in her hands, he stopped. The stillness that came over him was different from his usual stillness. His usual stillness was a choice. This one was not. "Île aux Grès," Lisette said. The word came out very quietly. 1970, August. I fell off the east wharf. Declan set down the crate of supplies he was carrying, slowly, as though he needed to do it slowly. "You were 8, he said. "You tied my hair back." Her voice was barely above a breath. "You found the ribbon." He moved to the opposite side of the wheelhouse and stood looking out through the rain-blurred glass at the dock. For a long moment he said nothing at all. "My family was passing through on a freight run," he said at last. "My father's boat. We were only docked 2 days." He stopped, seemed to reconsider. "I looked for you when we came back the following season. Your family had gone north for the summer. I was 17 by then. We didn't come back to that stretch again for years." A pause that had years in it. "And then I heard Thorne in a bar in Lavis, 3 weeks before I came to your door, talking about the Beaumont property and what he intended to do with it, talking about you." Lisette looked at the pale ribbon in her palm, the brass leaf, green with age. "You spent $600, she said. "Money is just weight," Declan said quietly. "It doesn't keep." He turned from the window then, and in the low gray light of the wheelhouse, his face was something she had not seen before from him. Stripped of the careful distance he maintained the way other men maintained their boats, with constant, deliberate effort. "I'm not a man who uses words easily," he said. "I'm not going to tell you I had some plan, or that any of this was right. I saw a way to keep you out of Thorn's hands, and I took it." "That's the whole of it." "That's not all of it," Lisette said. He didn't argue. That night, anchored off Rivière du Loup, in a quiet arm of the estuary, the season finally turned. The first real ice appeared along the shallows, thin as glass, cracking softly against the hull. Lisette sat in the galley, with her journal open in front of her, not writing, listening to the sounds of the boat settle around her. Felix snoring in the fore cabin, the engine ticking as it cooled, the slow groan of the anchor chain. She heard Declan moving around in the wheelhouse above, the familiar weight of him, and she understood that the fear she had carried aboard 3 weeks ago had been replaced, quietly and without ceremony, by something she did not yet have a name for. In the weeks that followed, the Sainte Marguerite ran her winter routes along the south shore. Rimouski, Rivière du Loup, Trois Pistoles, the crossings that other captains left to late autumn before the river froze in earnest. Declan knew the ice the way musicians know silence, where it was going, where it was lying about being solid. He taught Lisette to watch for the blue-green color in a flow that meant old ice, dangerous ice, and the milky white that meant new ice, which was worse. She absorbed it all with the same quiet attention she brought to everything, and he noticed, and did not say he noticed, but she began to find that he would explain things to her without being asked, stepping to her side at the rail and saying, "Look here," the way a person does when they trust the person beside them to look. December came down fast that year. It was a Friday morning, running west out of Maton in the pre-dawn dark, when Felix found the problem. A crack in the port shaft housing, small enough to miss in a quick inspection, large enough to be serious. They were running light, no freight, which was the only mercy. They limped into the Rimouski docks, with the port engine dead and the starboard working twice as hard as it should have been. The repair would take 3 days minimum. The part had to come from Montreal. Declan arranged a boarding house for Felix and the deckhand, and told Lisette she could take the dockmaster's guest room, which was private and heated. She told him she would stay on the boat. He looked at her for a moment, with the expression he sometimes wore, when she said something that surprised him. Not the large surprise of the unexpected, but the small surprise of a thing being exactly what he had hoped for. They spent those 3 days in a suspended kind of quiet, the urgency of the river removed, the boat still beneath them. Lisette cooked properly for the first time in weeks, with the gas range in the galley and the extra time to do it right. Declan sat across from her in the evenings with his charts and his log, occasionally reading something aloud without lifting his eyes, half to her and half to the air. A depth measurement, a forecast, a thing he had observed in the current near Ile Verte that he didn't entirely understand yet. She answered when she had something to say, and was quiet when she didn't, and he did the same, and the evenings were easy in a way that neither of them acknowledged directly. On the second night, the temperature dropped 15 degrees in 4 hours. Ice formed across the harbor entrance overnight, and by morning the dock was encased in a skin of frozen spray that made every surface treacherous. Lisette went up on deck before light to check the lines, and went down hard on the forward hatch, hitting her knee on the steel edge. She did not make a sound. She sat on the icy deck in the dark, gripping her leg, and breathed through it. Declan found her there 7 minutes later, coming up from the engine room with a flashlight and a wrench. He went down on one knee beside her without hesitating, setting the flashlight so the beam gave them light, and ran his hands over her knee with a clinical efficiency that turned careful at the edges. "Nothing broken," he said, after a moment. "I know," she said. "I've broken things before. I know the difference." He didn't move away. He stayed there, one hand still holding the outside of her knee, as though he'd forgotten it was there, his head bent, the flashlight throwing his face half into shadow. She could see the burn scar along his jaw in the pale light, the old mark of someone else's emergency, that he had absorbed and carried forward without complaint. "Declan," she said. He looked up. She had not planned what happened next. Later she would think that nothing meaningful ever is planned, that the river knows its course long before the boat does. She reached up and put her hand against the scarred side of his face, her cold fingers against the cold skin, and felt him go very still. Not the strategic stillness of a man holding back, but the absolute stillness of a man who has just received something he had stopped expecting. He covered her hand with his. His was warm, which surprised her. She had thought everything about him would be cold. It was not. The repair was finished late on the third day. Felix gave Lisette a single look when he came back aboard, the appraising look of a man who notices things and says nothing, and then went below to check the engine, and that was the end of it. They ran north again in January, as the Gulf ice thickened along the Gaspé coast, and the winter routes opened up in their strange frozen logic. Declan had contacts in Sept Isles, a community on the north shore that received supplies by sea when the roads became impassable. Flour, medicine, heating fuel, the unglamorous necessities of isolated winter living. They made 3 runs in 6 weeks, breaking through shore ice with the reinforced prow on days that made Felix mutter his prayers in Acadian French and make the young deckhand go white around the eyes. Lisette was on the bow for most of it, watching, reporting, occasionally reaching overboard with the ice pole when a chunk threatened the port side. Declan watched her from the wheelhouse with an expression she had learned to read by then, the expression of a man who has trusted a person with something valuable and is watching that trust prove itself out. It was on the 3rd return run from Sept Isles in the gray middle of a February that seemed to have no intention of ending that they received the radio call. Aldrich Thorne had not forgotten about the Beaumont property, it turned out. He had spent the autumn building a different kind of case, a legal argument, assembled in Quebec City, that Eugene Beaumont had fraudulently misrepresented the property value at the time of the original loan, which, if successful, would void the debt settlement entirely and return the matter to the courts. He had found a judge in the city with an interest in the outcome. He had filed in November. The hearing was in March. Lisette heard this from her father by radio, his voice thin and frightened through the static, and she sat with the handset in her lap for a long moment afterward, the engine noise filling the silence around her. Declan came and stood in the doorway of the radio room. He had heard enough. "We dock in Rimouski tomorrow morning," he said. "I know a lawyer in Lavis, old friend, honest, which on the civil side is rarer than you'd think." "You've already done enough," Lisette said. "I'm aware," he said. "I'm not asking you to. I know you're not." He came in and sat down across from her in the narrow space, his elbows on his knees, his scarred jaw set. "Listen, Thorne makes his money finding the gap between what the law says and what it does. The gap is smaller than he thinks, if you know where to push." "My friend knows where to push." "Why?" Lisette asked. She needed him to say it plainly. She had needed him to say many things plainly, and he was slowly learning how. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the river ice cracked and resettled, a sound like distant percussion. "Because what's yours should stay yours," he said. "And because I am not going to spend the rest of my life watching Thorne take things that don't belong to him." He held her gaze with the directness that she had come to understand was for him the most intimate thing he knew how to offer. "And because you are not a contract," he said quietly, "you never were." The hearing in Lavis took place on a cold morning in late March. Declan's lawyer was a small, sharp woman named Mathilde Arsenault, who had the posture of someone perpetually prepared to object and the reputation, apparently, of never losing a fraudulent instrument case. She dismantled Thorne's argument with a methodical patience that was almost peaceful to watch, producing original loan documents, witnessed correspondence, and a signed affidavit from the constable who had been present at the Beaumont property in October, who had, it turned out, his own opinions about Thorne's business practices and was not unwilling to commit them to paper. Thorne sat across the room in his bay rum-scented coat and watched his case dissolve with the expression of a man who has confused being unpleasant with being powerful for so long that he can no longer tell the difference. The debt settlement stood. The property remained with her parents. Any further legal action from Thorne in this matter would be considered vexatious and dealt with accordingly. Her father wept in the corridor afterward, quietly and without embarrassment. Her mother held his arm and looked at Declan over his head with the particular look of a woman who has spent a long time asking God for something sensible. That evening, on the wharf at Lévis with the Saint Lawrence running wide and dark below them, and the lights of Quebec City strung along the far shore, Lisette stood beside Declan and watched the river the way she had learned to watch it, reading the surface, what it was and what it intended to be. "My father wants to have you for dinner," she said. "All right. He's going to try to repay you." "He's not going to be able to," Declan said. "I know. I'm just warning you." A long pause. The river moved past them, unhurried, carrying its usual cargo of cold and distance and time. "What do you want to do?" Declan asked. "Not about dinner. Not about her parents." The question was the plain kind he was still learning to ask, and she had learned that when he asked those questions she should answer them honestly and not sideways. She turned and looked at the Sainte Marguerite, moored at the end of the dock, her running lights reflected in long yellow columns on the dark water. The boat that had terrified her 4 months ago, the river that had seemed like exile, the man she had stood next to in the wheelhouse, not knowing whether to trust him or fear him, both at once. She thought about the yellow ribbon in the tobacco tin, saved for 11 years by a 15-year-old boy, who had no particular reason to save it except that it had seemed like the right thing to do. Some people learn who a person is in the catastrophic moments. She had learned it in the coffee and the oilskin, and the careful way he'd run his hands over her knee in the dark, and in the long evenings in the galley where he read figures aloud to the air, and she pretended she wasn't listening, and they both knew she was. "I want to go back on the river," she said. He looked at her. That expression, the one she had seen on the dark deck in Rimouski, the absolute stillness of something unexpected and hoped for. "The North Shore run in April needs a second navigator," he said. "I'm aware," she said. "You're a terrible navigator alone. You nearly put us on a shoal outside Trois Pistoles. That shoal isn't on the charts." "I know. That's why you need me." He was quiet for a moment in the way that had stopped meaning absence and started meaning the opposite. "All right, then," Declan Rourke said, and the river kept moving beneath them, wide and cold and steady, carrying them both.